The phone call from the future. Lucas had always been a skeptic. He didn't believe in fortune tellers, psychic readings, or anything that claimed to predict the future. He had enough trouble keeping track of his own life to worry about what might happen next. His days were filled with work, gym time, and late-night video games. But there was something else in his life that filled the spaces between, the nagging feeling that he was meant for more, even if he didn't know what that was. It was a Tuesday when everything changed. Lucas was sitting in his cramped apartment, a cold cup of coffee resting by his elbow as he scrolled through his phone. Work had been stressful lately, and the thought of spending another 12-hour shift at the factory was enough to make him want to walk out. But bills had to be paid, and his ambitions had yet to find a solid outlet. His phone buzzed. A notification from an unknown number. Thinking it was spam, Lucas almost ignored it. But something about the timing felt off. He swiped open the message to find a single, strange text. "I'm you. I'm from the future." Lucas stared at the screen, unsure whether to laugh or be concerned. He quickly brushed it off. Maybe it was just some prank or a scam trying to get him to click on a link. But then, the phone buzzed again. It was a call. The same number. He hesitated. Should he answer it? Probably not, but curiosity won out. He swiped to accept the call. "Hello." The voice on the other end was distorted, like it was coming through a broken speaker. "I'm you," the voice repeated, this time more clearly, "I'm from the future." Lucas sat up straighter. Was someone messing with him? Maybe it was a weird glitch in the system, some kind of automated AI or a prank call. But the voice, it sounded too real. "Who is this?" he asked, trying to remain calm. "It's you," the voice replied. "It's you in 2 months." Lucas's mind raced. He wanted to hang up, but something kept him on the line, something almost magnetic. "What do you mean? Are you some kind of scammer or—" "I'm not," the voice interrupted. "I'm not a scammer. Listen closely. Something's going to happen, something important, and you're going to need to remember what I'm saying. You'll recognize it when it happens. It'll change everything for you." Lucas's heart began to race. This was no ordinary call. "What's going to happen?" he asked, his voice more hesitant now. The voice on the other end didn't answer immediately. For a long moment, there was nothing but static, and then a low hum, like an electrical buzz, filled the silence. Finally, the voice returned, almost whispering. "You're going to get an opportunity, an offer. Don't turn it down. It's the key to everything. If you say yes, it will change your life forever. But if you say no, things will never be the same." The hairs on the back of Lucas's neck stood up. "What kind of offer?" The voice paused, the static rising and falling as if it were caught in a storm. "I can't tell you exactly. But you'll know when it comes. Just don't turn it down. It'll seem small at first, but trust me. Take it." Lucas's thoughts were scattered. "This is crazy," he muttered to himself. "This is ridiculous." "I know it sounds insane," the voice replied. "But it's real. I'm you. I remember this conversation. You'll believe me when it happens. Just don't make the mistake I made. Don't turn it down." "Why are you telling me this?" Lucas demanded. "Why are you calling me? Why not just change everything yourself?" The voice was quiet for a long time. Then, it responded, "Because I can't. It's too late for me. But you still have a choice. Don't let it slip away." Before Lucas could respond, the call dropped. The line went dead, the silence in his apartment feeling heavier than it ever had before. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had that really just occurred? Could it have been a dream, or had he simply imagined it all? But everything felt too vivid, too real. And the words echoed in his head. You'll know when it happens. Take it. The next few weeks passed in a blur, the call fading into the back of his mind, buried beneath the weight of his ordinary life. He went to work, spent time with friends, and did his best to ignore the creeping doubt that gnawed at him. But every now and then, the thought returned. What if it was real? It wasn't until exactly 2 months later that Lucas received an email. He opened it absent-mindedly, expecting nothing more than a typical advertisement or another junk message. But it wasn't an ad. It was a job offer. The email was simple: a company called Nexus Solutions wanted to hire him for a position in their marketing department. The offer was generous, far more than he was making at the factory, and it came with the promise of upward mobility and stock options. The catch? The job would require a move across the country, to a city Lucas had never even thought about visiting. At first, Lucas hesitated. It seemed like a dream offer, but it also felt off. He had a stable job, friends in the area, and everything was going just fine, right? Why take the risk? But then the voice came back to him, like a whisper in his ear, filling his head with urgency. You'll recognize it when it happens. Take it. Suddenly, everything clicked. The call. The warning. This was it. The opportunity he had been waiting for, the one from the future. But there was one problem: the offer seemed too good to be true. And the nagging doubt crept back in. Could this really be his future self, calling to warn him? Or was he just being paranoid? Despite the voice in his head urging him forward, Lucas almost deleted the email, convinced it was a scam. But something stopped him. He couldn't explain it. It wasn't just fear, it was something else, something that felt like destiny. He clicked accept. Weeks passed, and Lucas moved to the city, started his new job, and settled into a new life. Everything about it seemed to be falling into place. The company was everything he'd hoped for and more. He excelled in his new role, made new friends, and began to feel a sense of purpose he had never experienced before. It wasn't until months later that he met someone who would change his life even more than the job offer had. Her name was Ava. She worked in the same department, and the two hit it off immediately. They spent hours talking about everything from work to their shared love of video games and old movies. Lucas quickly realized that he hadn't just accepted a job offer that changed his career, he had accepted an offer that had set him on a path toward meeting someone who would become a significant part of his life. But as time passed, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. One night, after a few too many drinks, he sat at his desk and dug through old files. He couldn't help it. Something about the company felt off. There were details in his files, small, seemingly insignificant things, that didn't add up. And then he found it, a document, buried deep within the system, that confirmed everything. Nexus Solutions wasn't a company, it was a front. A front for a much darker, more twisted organization. And the job offer? It wasn't about his skills. It was about something much bigger. But the most disturbing part? The person who had recruited him, the one who had sent him that fateful email, was a woman named Ava. His Ava. The voice in his head whispered again, but this time it wasn't the future speaking. It was the past. I'm you. Take the offer. Lucas's world tilted. What had seemed like a gift had been a carefully laid trap all along. The job, the move, meeting Ava, it had all been part of a plan to pull him into something far bigger than himself. But the worst part? He was stuck. There was no going back now. And the real question was, had he ever really made the choice at all? The unexpected gift. Jenna had always believed that life was nothing more than a series of choices. Every day, we choose our paths, decide where to go, what to do, and who to become. But the one thing Jenna could never seem to choose was her happiness. She wasn't unhappy, necessarily, but there was a feeling deep inside her that something was missing. It was like a hole, just big enough to remind her that she wasn't quite where she was meant to be. She had a good job, a steady routine, and friends she could rely on. Yet, every so often, she would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was it. Was this all life had to offer? Or was there something more out there, something just beyond her reach? One morning, Jenna woke up to a surprise. There, sitting on her doorstep, was a package. It was small, nondescript, wrapped in brown paper with no return address. Her first instinct was to ignore it. After all, strange things had a habit of appearing on her doorstep from time to time, and usually, they weren't anything worth thinking about. But something tugged at her, an odd curiosity that she couldn't shake off. She bent down and picked up the package. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, and there was a strange warmth to it, almost like it had been sitting in the sun for too long. Jenna looked around, expecting someone to jump out from behind the bushes, but the street was empty. With a mixture of apprehension and intrigue, she brought the package inside. The wrapping was simple, easy to tear off. Inside, she found a small, brass key and a folded note. She opened the note and read, "This is for you. Unlock it." The words didn't make sense. Unlock what? There was no context, no explanation, just the key and the cryptic message. Jenna turned the key over in her hand, examining it. It wasn't anything special, just an old-fashioned skeleton key, but there was something undeniably familiar about it. Something about the way it felt in her hand, like it had been waiting for her. She sat down on her couch, the key resting on the coffee table in front of her. For the next few hours, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something, that she was supposed to do something with this key. But what? And why now? It was just a key, a trivial thing, really, something that could belong to any old lock. But the note, that note stuck with her. Unlock it. Jenna spent the entire day searching her apartment for any locks the key might fit. She tried it on the front door, the back door, the bathroom cabinets, even her bedroom dresser, but none of them worked. The key didn't fit anywhere. Her curiosity grew into frustration, and by the time the sun was setting, she was ready to throw the thing away. What was the point of having a key if it didn't unlock anything? But then, as she was cleaning up, she happened to glance out of her apartment window. Across the street stood an old, abandoned building. She'd noticed it before, but it never caught her attention quite like this. There was something in the air, something magnetic about the way the building loomed, dark and forgotten. Without thinking, Jenna grabbed the key, shoved it into her coat pocket, and left her apartment. She didn't even bother locking the door behind her. Her feet seemed to move of their own accord, carrying her across the street, toward the building. It had always been a mystery, a relic of the past, standing untouched for years. But now, as she stood in front of it, it felt different. It felt important. The door was old, rusted, and weathered, but it wasn't locked. Jenna hesitated for only a second before she turned the handle and pushed it open. The door creaked as it swung inward, revealing a dark hallway that seemed to stretch on forever. The air inside smelled like dust, decay, and something else she couldn't quite place, something musty and forgotten. She stepped inside, her heart pounding with excitement and fear. The building was eerily silent, save for the sound of her footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The walls were lined with peeling paint and cracked wood, remnants of a time long past. Jenna walked slowly, her eyes scanning every corner, her fingers brushing against the walls as she passed. At the end of the hallway, she saw a door. It was small, unremarkable, but there was something about it that drew her in. Without thinking, she walked toward it, the key now burning a hole in her pocket. She had to know what it opened. She had to find out what she was meant to unlock. When she reached the door, she pulled the key from her pocket and slipped it into the lock. It turned effortlessly, as if the lock had been waiting for this exact moment. The door opened with a soft squeak, revealing a room bathed in shadow. Jenna stepped inside. It wasn't what she had expected. The room wasn't empty, nor was it decayed like the rest of the building. Instead, it was pristine, untouched by time. There was a table in the center of the room, covered with objects, photographs, books, old letters, and a few strange trinkets she couldn't recognize. It looked like someone had lived here recently, like someone had left in a hurry. The air was different in this room. It felt alive, as though it held secrets waiting to be discovered. She walked closer to the table, her eyes scanning the items before her. There were photographs of people she didn't know, but in the back of her mind, there was a faint recognition. Faces that seemed familiar, like they belonged to a past she couldn't remember. The letters, too, were old, yellowed with age, and though she couldn't read them, she felt a connection, a strange sense of belonging. And then she saw it. At the far end of the table, sitting on a small pedestal, was a mirror. It wasn't large, just a simple hand mirror, but it gleamed in the dim light as if it were calling to her. Something in her chest tightened. She walked over to it, her fingers trembling as she reached out to touch the glass. As soon as her fingers brushed the surface, the room around her shifted. The mirror rippled like water, and for a brief, disorienting moment, Jenna felt like she was falling. She stumbled backward, gasping for breath. When she looked up again, everything had changed. The room was different. The photographs were gone, the table had disappeared, and now, she stood in a place that felt like her own apartment, but it wasn't. It couldn't be. The walls were the same, but there was something subtly wrong. The air was thicker, like it was suffocating her. She felt a cold draft run through the room, and she turned to find the door she had come through, no longer there. Panic set in. What was happening? A voice, soft and familiar, echoed in her mind. You unlocked it. Jenna's heart pounded in her chest as the realization hit her like a tidal wave. She had opened something that couldn't be closed again. She didn't know what it was, or how, but the key had led her here, to this moment, and there was no turning back. The mirror had shown her a path, but now, the path was uncertain. It was too late to go back. She was part of whatever this was now. Jenna turned to face the mirror once more. She could feel it, an undeniable pull, like a door opening into another world. A world she was meant to enter. But at what cost? Jenna stood frozen, staring at the mirror. The room around her seemed to shimmer in the reflection, but it wasn't her apartment. It was different. The walls were the same, but the colors were slightly off, like someone had applied a filter, turning everything colder, darker. The furniture was rearranged, but it felt familiar, too familiar. She took a cautious step forward. Her breath caught in her throat as she looked closer into the mirror, her reflection hazy but not quite like hers. The woman staring back at her was slightly older, her expression more worn. The lines beneath her eyes were deeper, as if the years had passed in a way Jenna couldn't quite understand. For a moment, she wondered if it was a trick of the light. But then, the reflection moved before she did, and a chill ran down her spine. The woman in the mirror smiled at her. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was knowing, almost as if it held a secret that Jenna wasn't yet ready to know. What is this? She whispered, more to herself than to the reflection. Her voice echoed in the room. But the woman in the mirror didn't answer. Instead, her smile grew wider, more unsettling. She reached out with her hand, as if to touch the glass. Jenna's heart skipped a beat, and before she could even register what was happening, her hand moved involuntarily toward the surface of the mirror. Her fingertips brushed the cold glass, and in that instant, the room around her seemed to warp. The walls distorted, bending inward like they were made of paper. The floor seemed to fall away beneath her feet, and her stomach lurched. She stumbled, barely managing to keep her balance. A wave of nausea washed over her, but before she could react, everything snapped back into place. Jenna found herself standing in the same room, but this time, it was completely different. The mirror was no longer in front of her. Instead, the table she had seen earlier was back, along with the photographs, letters, and trinkets. But they weren't the same items. They were newer, fresher, and, if she was honest with herself, more like things she'd seen before. The photographs were of her, but they weren't just pictures she had taken herself. They were moments she didn't remember, ones that felt like fragments of a forgotten past. There she was, smiling with strangers she didn't know, standing in places she couldn't recall visiting. Each photograph was dated with days that didn't align with her own memories. The letters scattered on the table were addressed to her, but the handwriting was unfamiliar. The words inside, though, seemed to speak directly to her heart, as if they were written by someone who understood everything she had ever felt. A sudden realization struck Jenna like a bolt of lightning. These weren't just things. They were pieces of a life she hadn't lived, yet. Her breath quickened. Her hands shook as she picked up a letter, trembling as she unfolded it. It was dated only a few weeks into the future, but the words written inside felt impossibly distant. Jenna, don't be afraid. You've been chosen. The key you hold will unlock a world that you've been blind to all along. It's waiting for you to step into it, but you must trust the path. There is more here than you understand. Don't turn away. Her chest tightened. She dropped the letter, her head spinning. Chosen. Path. What was this? The world she had known, the life she had thought was ordinary, suddenly felt like a thin veil, something that could be lifted at any moment. She couldn't look away from the photographs, her image staring back at her in each one. There was a movement out of the corner of her eye. Jenna turned, and for the briefest moment, she thought she saw the figure from the mirror standing at the doorway, just out of reach. Her heart pounded as she rushed to the door, but when she opened it, there was no one there. Only a long, empty hallway that stretched on, disappearing into the darkness. Confused, she stepped out into the hallway, the air feeling heavier with every breath. The silence was thick, almost oppressive, as if the very walls were watching her, waiting for her to make her next move. She tried to force the panic back down, but it clawed at the edges of her mind. What the hell is happening? As she walked down the hall, the key in her pocket seemed to grow warmer, pulsing against her side like a heartbeat of its own. It was as if it were alive, reacting to the very space she was in. She could feel it, too, an undeniable pull, urging her forward. At the end of the hallway, there was another door, this one small and unmarked. She hadn't noticed it before, but now, it seemed to beckon her, its presence both familiar and alien. She hesitated, but only for a moment. Without another thought, she turned the handle, and the door creaked open. Inside was another room, this one even stranger than the last. The space was bathed in a pale blue light, casting long shadows across the walls. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on it, an object covered in a white cloth. Jenna moved closer, her heart pounding. She reached out, trembling, and lifted the cloth. Underneath was a book. It wasn't like any book she had ever seen. The cover was made of what looked like leather, but the texture was unlike anything human. It seemed to shift, as though the material were alive, breathing. The book was heavy, too heavy for its size, and the moment Jenna touched it, a jolt of energy passed through her, causing her to gasp in surprise. The pages were blank at first, but as her fingers brushed over them, words began to appear, as if the ink were materializing before her eyes. The words were in a language she didn't recognize, but somehow, she understood them. The key has been unlocked. You are the one. The door will open, and you will step into the unknown. But beware, for once you step through, you cannot return. Jenna's heart stopped. The book was a guide. A manual for everything she had just experienced. It told her everything she needed to know, but nothing that made sense. It explained the key, the mirror, the room, the strange visions, and yet the answers it provided only raised more questions. Why had she been chosen? What was waiting for her on the other side? The air seemed to hum with anticipation, and Jenna felt as though the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for her to decide. The voice from before echoed in her mind, clearer now, "Step through." But what would happen if she did? What kind of world would she be stepping into? She looked down at the book again, the words blurring in front of her as if they were shifting, trying to tell her more. But she couldn't make sense of them anymore. The book had its secrets, and now, it was up to her to uncover them. The key was still in her pocket, and she could feel it calling to her. Jenna took a deep breath, the weight of the choice pressing down on her. There was no turning back. Whatever she had unlocked, whatever door she had opened, was not just a part of some forgotten past. It was her future. And it was waiting for her. The Silent Musician. Amelia Hart had always been the kind of person who seemed destined for greatness. From the moment her tiny fingers first touched the keys of a piano, there was an unmistakable magic in the air. She was a child prodigy, the kind that everyone in the music world whispered about, anticipating her future with a mix of admiration and envy. But Amelia didn't care for the whispers, or the attention. Music had always been her escape, her secret world where nothing else mattered but the sound of her fingers moving fluidly across the ivory keys. Her parents, both accomplished musicians themselves, recognized the talent early on. They supported her, of course, but they were careful not to push too hard. Amelia never needed pushing. She lived and breathed music. From Chopin to Beethoven, her repertoire expanded faster than any child her age could hope to accomplish. She was often the youngest person in the room when she performed, and yet she commanded respect like an old master. By age 12, Amelia had already performed at some of the most prestigious concert halls in the world. It wasn't uncommon for a full orchestra to accompany her during her recitals. People came to see her play because they didn't just want to hear music, they wanted to witness something transcendent. Amelia's performances weren't just displays of technical skill, they were emotional journeys. Each note carried weight, like a word she could never quite speak, but still needed to say. Despite her rising fame, Amelia remained somewhat detached. She was never the starlet with the gossip column blurbs or the endless interviews. In fact, she avoided them whenever possible. Her focus was singular, always the music. Her life was mapped out in concert dates, practices, and awards. Yet, the constant pressure of being the best began to take its toll, though she never let it show. Behind the flawless performances, something was quietly fraying. Amelia's parents started noticing the subtle shifts in their daughter. She would practice for hours, her eyes distant and hollow, her hands robotic in their movements. She no longer smiled when she played. There were no more gleams of excitement in her eyes. She began to withdraw from everyone, even her closest friends. The fame that once seemed like a blessing started to feel more like a cage, and Amelia had no idea how to escape from it. By the time she turned 17, the world had already decided she was a genius. It didn't matter if she wanted it or not. They expected perfection. Every note she played, every piece she composed, every stage she stepped onto, there was only one thing they wanted: more. And each time she gave it to them, the emptiness inside her grew. One evening, after a particularly grueling performance in Vienna, Amelia stood backstage, her body drenched in sweat. The roaring applause felt distant, like it came from another world. She smiled, waved, and gave the usual gracious thank yous, but her heart wasn't in it. She walked straight to her dressing room, past the photographers and reporters, barely registering them at all. Victor, her manager, followed closely behind, as he always did. "You were perfect tonight, Amelia," he said, his tone flat but practiced. "The crowd loved you." She didn't respond. She sat down at the piano in her dressing room, her fingers resting on the keys. Victor watched her, confused. This wasn't like her. She had always been so energetic after a performance, her adrenaline high from the applause. But tonight, she was still, almost unnervingly so. "Amelia?" Victor asked gently. "What's wrong?" She didn't look up at him. Her fingers began to play, not a piece from her usual repertoire, but something new, something strange. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, like a whisper of a melody. Then it grew, swelling into a haunting, dissonant tune, unlike anything anyone had ever heard before. "Amelia," Victor said, stepping closer, "what is this?" But she didn't stop playing. She didn't even acknowledge him. The music seemed to come from somewhere else, some place beyond her conscious control. It was as if her fingers were simply conduits for something greater, something that had a life of its own. When the music stopped, she stood up, walked past Victor, and left the room without a word. The next morning, she was gone. Victor waited for her return, assuming it was just a momentary lapse, something caused by exhaustion or stress. But as the days passed, his concern grew. No one could get in touch with her. Her phone went unanswered, and when he went to her apartment, it was empty. There were no clues as to where she had gone or why she had left. The world was still waiting for her to come back on stage, but Amelia was nowhere to be found. Her parents were frantic. They had no answers, no theories, only questions that led to more confusion. Amelia's disappearance was a mystery that gripped the media. Some speculated that she was sick, while others believed she had simply burnt out. No one knew for sure. Even her closest friends hadn't heard from her. Months passed, and the world slowly moved on. The media found new stars to talk about, new musicians to idolize, and Amelia Hart faded into the background, her absence a quiet, unspoken void in the world of music. But then, one day, Amelia returned. It wasn't a grand reappearance, there were no announcements or press releases. She simply showed up at her parents' house in the suburbs, as though nothing had ever happened. Her mother opened the door, and there stood her daughter, looking almost unchanged. But there was something in her eyes now, a depth that hadn't been there before. The vibrant young woman who had once filled the stage with light now seemed like a shadow of herself. "Amelia," her mother said softly, pulling her into an embrace. "Where have you been? We were so worried." Amelia didn't say anything at first. She simply walked past her mother and into the living room, where she sat by the window, staring out into the empty street. Her parents exchanged a glance but said nothing. They knew not to push her. For the next few weeks, Amelia remained reclusive. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her words seemed distant, almost detached. She seemed like a ghost, a memory of the person she had once been. But one day, she called her parents into the living room. She had a sheet of music in her hands. "I wrote this," she said, her voice soft but steady. Her parents took the sheet music, but neither of them spoke. They looked down at the notes, their confusion growing. This was not music Amelia had composed before. It was intricate, yes, but it was also strange, disjointed in a way that felt uncomfortable, even eerie. The melody didn't flow like her usual compositions. There was something unsettling about it, something that didn't fit with the genius they had known. They tried to ask her about it, but Amelia simply smiled, as if there were no more words left to say. She excused herself and went to her room, leaving the sheet music behind. Her parents looked at each other, unspoken questions hanging in the air. What had happened to their daughter? Where had she been all this time, and why had she stopped playing? But no answers came. Only the sheet music remained, framed and hanging on the wall, a haunting reminder of the woman who had once filled the world with her music. Then, just as suddenly as she had returned, Amelia disappeared again. She was gone without a trace. Her room was untouched, the sheets on her bed still perfectly made. The door to her house was locked, and there was no sign of forced entry. It was as though she had simply vanished, leaving behind only the music that no one could understand. Her parents, the police, and even her old friends searched for her, but there were no clues. Nothing. Just the haunting melody, lingering in the air, filling the empty space where she used to be. Years passed, and the mystery of Amelia Hart faded into obscurity. The concert halls that once buzzed with her name fell silent. The music world moved on. But in the quiet corners of her family's house, the sheet music remained. And in the back of their minds, they wondered if Amelia was still out there, somewhere, playing a melody that only she could hear. The Collector of Echoes. When Elena moved into the old house on Hollow Creek Road, she didn't expect much. It wasn't her first choice. She had always dreamt of something more modern, more convenient. But after losing her job, her savings had dwindled to almost nothing, and the house, with its creaky floorboards and dim rooms, was all she could afford. Her friends had warned her against it. "It's too far out," they said. "It's abandoned for a reason." But Elena didn't care. She had no family to speak of, and no reason to stick around the city. She just needed somewhere quiet to restart her life. It was perfect for that. The house had been empty for years. The previous owner, an eccentric man named Everett Caldwell, had disappeared without a trace. The neighbors spoke of him in hushed tones, telling stories of his strange behavior and the odd happenings that surrounded his life. The rumors were just that, rumors. But as Elena unpacked, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. The house, despite its size, seemed too quiet. Every footstep echoed as though the walls themselves were listening. One evening, as she explored the dusty attic, Elena found an old leather-bound book. It was wedged between two crates covered in cobwebs. The book wasn't particularly large, but it had a weight to it, like it was holding something inside that wanted to escape. The cover was worn and faded, with no title, just a strange symbol embossed into the surface, an eye with wings. Curiosity piqued, Elena opened the book. The pages were yellowed and brittle, the ink faded but still legible. At first glance, the text seemed like gibberish, an indecipherable jumble of words. But as she flipped through, her eyes lingered on a page near the end. It was filled with drawings, sketches of faces, each one eerily familiar. The people in the sketches looked almost lifelike, their eyes wide with a strange intensity, their expressions frozen in time. Then, beneath one of the sketches, was a name. Elena's name. She blinked, leaning in closer. The drawing of her was strange, almost like a portrait, but distorted, as though the artist had drawn her from memory, not from life. But the real shock came when she read the words beneath it. "She is the next." Elena dropped the book in shock, her heart racing. She stumbled backward, her thoughts whirling. What did it mean? How could this be in the book, in this old house where no one had lived for years? Was it just a coincidence, or had someone like Everett, known she would come here? But who would draw such a thing? The book slipped from her hands, but as she knelt to pick it up, something caught her attention. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper, like a soft breeze brushing against her ear. Elena froze, her blood turning cold. She glanced around the attic, but there was no one there. Only the old boxes, the forgotten things of a life long gone. The whisper came again. "Stay." She shuddered and quickly closed the book, her hands trembling. She wasn't sure why, but she felt an overwhelming urge to leave the attic. It wasn't just fear, it was something deeper, something primal. She didn't want to stay in that room any longer. Over the next few days, Elena tried to push the book and its strange contents from her mind. She went about her life, cooking, cleaning, trying to settle into her new routine. But the house, the book, and that eerie whisper lingered. The faces in the sketches kept resurfacing in her thoughts, as though they were etched into her memory. Then, on the fourth night after finding the book, the dreams started. At first, they were subtle, just fleeting images, fragmented like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't quite put together. But as the days passed, they grew more vivid. In the dreams, she was standing in the same attic, surrounded by the same boxes, but something was different. There were shadows in the corners of the room, moving like tendrils of smoke. And in the center, a figure, tall, thin, and impossibly still, stood watching her. It was Everett Caldwell. She tried to speak to him, but no words came. He didn't move, not even when she stepped closer. His eyes, wide and empty, stared into hers, unblinking, as though he could see into her soul. Then, without warning, his mouth opened. "You are the next." She would wake up, drenched in sweat, her heart racing in her chest. But each night, the dreams grew stronger. They weren't just dreams anymore, they were memories, haunting her with fragments of a life she had never lived. One evening, after another sleepless night, Elena decided she couldn't ignore it any longer. The dreams, the whispers, the book, it all felt connected. She needed to know what had happened to Everett Caldwell, why he had disappeared, and why his strange obsession with her seemed to persist even in death. The following morning, she visited the local library to dig into the history of the house. She found little information about Caldwell at first. There were no official records of his disappearance, just rumors that suggested he had gone mad, his mind unraveling under the weight of something he had discovered. One old newspaper article mentioned his obsession with collecting echoes, but the details were sparse, and the article itself was vague and cryptic. But there was one detail that caught her eye, an old photograph of Everett Caldwell, standing in front of the house with a solemn expression. His eyes seemed different in the photo, distant, like he was staring at something beyond the lens. And behind him, just barely visible, was the faint outline of a figure, one that looked eerily familiar. It looked like her. Elena's breath caught in her throat. How could that be possible? She hadn't even moved to this town until just a few days ago. But the resemblance was undeniable. As she stared at the photo, a realization slowly crept over her. The echoes Caldwell had been collecting weren't just sounds. They weren't even memories. They were people, moments in time, captured and stored in a way that made them eternal. A sickening thought gripped Elena's chest. Was she now part of his collection? Later that night, as she lay in bed, the whispers returned. They weren't distant this time, they were inside her head, swirling like a storm, louder and clearer than ever before. "You are the next. You belong to me." Elena bolted upright, her body covered in sweat. The room felt colder than before, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretching toward her like long fingers. Her heart pounded as she frantically looked around, her pulse quickening. The book, she had to find it. It had to hold the answers. She ran up to the attic, her hands shaking as she reached for the book. The moment her fingers touched it, the room seemed to freeze. The whispers stopped. The shadows receded. But the silence didn't last. The book opened on its own, flipping through pages at an alarming rate. Finally, it stopped. The pages were covered with more drawings, more faces. But this time, they weren't just sketches. They were photographs. Polaroid-style images of people, their eyes wide with terror, their faces frozen in time. Some of them she recognized, faces from the town, from the library, people she had passed on the street. And there, at the very end, was her face, her exact image, the same as in the photograph at the library. Her name was written beneath it. Elena Hart, the final echo. The room seemed to tilt. Elena stumbled back, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The book was some kind of ledger, cataloging the lives of everyone who had ever entered this house. Each page marked a person, a life, frozen at the moment they had crossed paths with Everett Caldwell. Her name was at the end because she was the last. She was the final piece, the one he had been waiting for. As she stood there, the realization hit her with the full force of a tidal wave. Everett Caldwell hadn't disappeared. He had been trapped, bound to the house, collecting echoes of lives he had stolen and preserved in time, in memory, in that book. And now, she was the final echo. The house had claimed her, just as it had claimed him. In the reflection of the glass, she saw him again, Everett Caldwell, standing just behind her, his eyes wide, his mouth open in a silent scream. "You belong to me now," the whisper said, clearer than ever. "Welcome to the collection."